Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. I can't believe how much feedback I've received on my Arkham's Astrolabe video. Thank you so much. Drixus of the PDH Pals did an entire reaction video which I absolutely loved. I call my videos a discussion because I want people to respond. He disagreed with me quite a bit and I want to respond back. I also have a long video ahead of me, so I hope you'll forgive me for summarizing. He said that bans in other formats don't translate to the card being broken in PDH. He's obviously right that the context of a ban is extremely important. That's why I didn't just make the point that it's good there, so it must be good here. I looked at how each ban announcement was worded, and read where they stated that the card was good enough just as a mana fixer to be good in many decks, regardless of strategy, which does translate in my opinion. Every benefit that I point out after that is just to show how often you can get extra value with it. He does bring up an important piece of context of there not being the same redundancy in PDH as 60 card formats. When you put Arkham's Astrolabe in your deck, it does only help you in games where you draw it, but I feel like turning down these advantageous games is suboptimal. He's right that you can't act like you're always going to have it in play though, that's why I tried to highlight cards that were probably already in your decks. He also disagreed with some of the cards being worth including in the discussion. I agree that a few of them aren't super common. Some more examples I could have given was that if you hit it on an impulse draw, it converts it into a normal draw as efficiently as possible. It's also an efficient way to draw off of Into the Royal, it adds to All That Glitters, can be tapped to Sunshot Militia, and other tiny things that I'm not going to be able to name all of. He also had an issue with me just saying that it's good sacrifice fodder, because that goes for pretty much anything. I disagree because there are very few other permanents that draw you a card and stay in play for 1 mana. On top of that, Astrolabe is still an exceptional mana filter. I think that makes it uniquely good at being sacrificed. Thanks, Drixus. Now on to the main topic, a guide to lands and mana bases in PDH. When I do it, I pretty much go through the lands in this order for 2-color mana bases. First I add Command Tower because it's an untapped dual land. I then add Ash Barrens. Ash Barrens is an auto include because if you cycle it on the turn that you play the land, it's better than a tapped dual because if you're lacking a color, you get your new color immediately. It also allows you to cycle it on a prior turn to the one that you play the land, which is a great way to spend extra mana at instant speed. All of that while still allowing you to play it untapped in a pinch makes it a staple. And then usually add Opal Palace, it enters untapped and its ability can win you games by making your commander huge. Some things to consider with it are that it's actually a subpar mana fixer, so if you're playing something like Gretchen Titchwillow, where a colorless land on turn 2 would mean that you can't play her on curve, it's probably not worth it. She also seldom wins through combat anyway, and she starts out of range of 2 mana board wipes, so the exclusion is justified. I've also found that there are quite a few decks with commanders that cost 5 or more where the commanders are difficult enough to cast to begin with that excluding Opal Palace has felt justified there as well. Don't get me wrong though, by default this starts in most of my decks, but I'm not afraid to cut it in the right circumstance. After Opal Palace, I consider Forge of Heroes. It has all of the same considerations as Opal Palace, except Forge of Heroes' benefit doesn't increase over the course of the game like Opal Palace does, and you can use Forge of Heroes if your commander enters the battlefield without being cast, like with a Flicker spell or a Reanimation spell. Also consider that both of these cards benefit from decks that are good at ramping, because they're more likely able to pay the extra mana on top of the command tax. This is a good time to talk about Study Hall. It works similar to Opal Palace and Forge of Heroes, adding a tax for a benefit, which is scry on this instead of +1/+1 counters. I've tried it in a few decks and haven't loved it. I think the time that I've seen it used best is in Papa Popper's Throll Parasite deck, and I think that's because it's a 1-mana monocolored commander. Another problem I have with Study Hall is that I'm not a huge fan of scrying. Difference in quality of a good card in Pauper versus a bad one is less than it is in other formats, and I'm not trying to avoid drawing lands like I am in 60 card formats, because I know my commander will eventually be a very expensive spell that I need to play. I then add the untapped artifact lands if I can find a benefit in doing so, like in All That Glitters, Trinket Mage, or Deadly Dispute. I think the cost of running these lands is so low that they push cards with a synergy with them into more decks. Past the cards we've discussed so far though, I don't run many other untapped utility lands because if we look at our options, there's a group that must be sacrificed to work, namely Captivating Cave, Cave of Temptation, Cradle of the Accursed, Haunted Vengraph, and Quicksand. They all produce colorless mana, which is a significant drawback. They're also unappealing because I hate giving up mana sources in PDH, where I'm going to have to play my commander again and again. There's another group that don't need to be sacrificed to do something when they enter, like Crystal Grotto, Glimmerpost, Radiant Fountain, Seraph Sanctuary, and Sunscorched Desert. They all also produce colorless mana. The one-time effects on these are really minor. I'll save these for my life gain synergy decks, and Sunscorched Desert as a win con in Flicker decks maybe. Crystal Grotto is one that a lot of players love, but I'll admit that I cut them when I'm playing other people's lists. The ones that enter untapped and have an ability that don't require them to be sacrificed are some of the most tempting, but over time, they've been coming out of decks. Cassia's Dig Site is the biggest one that comes to mind. My decks have gotten better at having things to do without overpriced mana sinks like this, and games have been ending earlier, which is why I've been removing them. Next we have Desert, which can be used to kill a 1 toughness attacker or add the damage to a blocked creature. When I've played it, I felt the pain of being colorless far more often than I've actually activated it. It probably deterred some attackers, but it's also been coming out of decks. The Tron lands technically fit in this category, but those are obviously not good in this format. The next two are much more complicated, Basilisk Gate and Heap Gate. They're more complicated because you need to play the color producing gates to be worth it, which enter tapped, which means we've run into the question, how many tap lands should I play? You could just play all of them. In a 2-color deck, that would mean you play the 2 colorless untapped gates, 1 Guild Gate, 2 of the gates that have you declare a color, and Gateway Plaza. Even in the decks where I include the gates, I want a mana base to do more than what the gates offer, but that starts us with 4 tapped lands. To keep my tapped land count low, I usually cut Gateway Plaza. It stands out to me because you have to pay 1 when it comes into play, so it's even worse than a tapped land. In a 3-color deck though, you can run the 2 colorless untapped gates, 3 Guild Gates, as well as 3 of the ones that have you declare a color, and Gateway Plaza. Again, I still don't play Gateway Plaza in 3-color decks because without it, we're already at 6 tapped gates. To see how much of our tapped land budget we've used, I figured that we need a frame of reference, so I decided to look at a ton of lists and note how many tapped lands they run. In my last video, I claimed that an average deck runs between 6 and 10 tapped lands, which Strixus said was too high. That made me realize that I need to delve deeper into this. I figured that pretty much any way I do this was going to be flawed for a myriad of reasons, so I decided to just look up lists from the prominent people in the PDH community. I included every public list I could find for these players, and didn't let any of them know I was doing this, so there are some out-of-date or experimental lists included in this, so take this information with a grain of salt. I included all of the decks from the PDH Pals, the hosts of the PDH Pod, Papa Popper, Derek Scarecrow Clay and Ruff again from the Rules Committee, the hosts of the Common Theory podcast, Chris from One More Game, Inkylosaur, Islane, Daxka's Face, Bobby Beefine, all of the decks from the Rags to Riches 2023 tournaments, the first 3 Sanctuary Opens, the first Common Cause tournament, and my own decks. 1,015 total. I plan to do more, but manually counting tapped lands isn't as fun as you would think, and to be clear, I always counted the Eldraine lands like Mystic Sanctuary as tapped lands. This represents all of the decks together. If we compare that to my claim of 6 to 10, I'd have to say that I was wrong, but I think I was bound to be. I didn't add any qualifiers to my statement, which made it include everything from colorless decks to 5-color decks. Luckily though, I noted the colors of each deck so we can break this down. This chart compares the number of colors of each deck and how many tap lands they run. As expected, the majority of decks were 1 or 2 colors, and you can see that monocolor decks have a lower tap land count. When I saw this, a few things surprised me. First, I wasn't expecting monocolor decks to have so many tap lands. Most were playing 4 or 5 tap lands. I also wasn't expecting such a broad range for 2-color decks. It looks like between 4 and 13 would be a more accurate number for me to give in my last video, but that says more about the non-uniformity of PDH mana bases than giving players an idea of how many to play, but it's safe to assume that over time, players are less likely to play tap lands, and the more competitive a deck list is, the less tap lands it has. Back this up, I marked if a deck was part of organized play. The average 2-color deck in organized play had about 6.9 tap lands. Nice. If you only look at the online events that I think get more dedicated players, the average is about 5.8. The average non-organized play deck had about 8.5. That could also be because all of the organized play events are more recent, but I still think that it supports my claim that competitive deck lists played less tap lands. Now that we have a frame of reference, let's circle back to the gates. With a 2-color mana base, playing the gates means we start at 3 tap lands. This doesn't leave a lot of room for anything else if we're trying to play the barest minimum of tap lands, and I can't stress how important that can be when you're trying to squeeze every last bit of power out of your list in competitive play. To me, the most obvious example of this is if on turn 3 you really need to play something that costs 2. If you also have an untapped 2-mana rock, an untapped land lets you play the rock and the 2-mana spell. The next turn you'll be 1 mana positive, which lets you do something proactive like play a creature that draws you a card. Every turn after that, you'll be able to play 1 mana more worth of spells. Those cards can also produce more value. My point is that having the extra mana early can have a cascading effect over the course of the game, so every tapped land matters, and needs a pretty great reason to be in your deck. Anyway, 3 tapped lands doesn't give us a lot of room when we're trying to be lower than the average 6.5 for 2-color decks in organized play, but that's not to say that every deck wants an extremely low land count. Personally, I found that having a higher tapped land count is better in slower decks. Let's also compare 3-color decks. There were only 4 total 3-color decks in organized play, which had an average of 12.5 tapped lands. There were 61 total 3-color decks in the overall sample, and they had an average of 11.3. Even with the 6 tapped lands we were considering running, this leaves much more room for our lands to do more. Because of this, I've only been putting the Gates package in decks with 3 or more colors. The Gates also go better in a 3-color deck because of the ones that allow you to name a color. If you compare them to a dual land like the other Gates, they're strictly better because they always represent your missing color. If you compare them to a fetch land like Evolving Wilds, both lands are able to find you your missing color, but the Gate still acts like a dual land later, which makes them pretty good. The same holds true for 5-color decks to the point where I also include Thriving Lands in them. There were only 18 total 5-color decks in the overall sample, which had an average of 18.8 tapped lands. Granted, you could be running 16 tapped Gates and 2 untapped ones now, but I haven't seen a deck willing to go that all in. I actually don't think that the Gates package is worth it in a lot of decks. My reason being that it encourages a high tapped land count and gets better with longer games, which allows you to play more Gates and more colors, which is going to slow you down. That puts this in more of a mid-range and control territory, and those decks are usually pretty good at already having things to do into the late game. The only meta Gates deck that I've seen in any format is the one in Pauper that uses Squadron Hawk, and that's a slower deck too. Obviously you can build around it more in a 60-card deck because you can run 4 Basilisk Gates, and your deck is smaller. The strategy also really does hinge on having a small number of the payoff cards, so I think that it's worth discussing land tutors at this point. I told you that the Gates were complicated. Expedition map would be my first impression on what to add. It can find Opal Palace too, which is true of all of the land tutors, which makes me second guess on adding Gates to the deck. Is it really worth dedicating land slots to Gates when it takes up so much space? Sometimes the answer is still yes, so 3 mana will get you your most important gate. Outside of green, many players use Navigation Orb. Cultivate already feels slow for this format, and paying 2 more so that you can have your Basilisk Gate doesn't seem worth it. Yes, you can immediately play it from your hand and activate it, but you're essentially 8 mana into your investment so far for a sorcery speed giant growth? The best logic in putting the Gates into your deck is that it's relatively free and repeatable. That's nice, but Navigation Orb is definitely not free, and I think it's a bridge too far. In green there's Crop Rotation, which is another whole can of worms. Obviously you can sacrifice a land to put Basilisk Gate into play untapped, which refunds the mana, making it incredibly efficient on top of being instant speed. But Crop Rotation opens up your whole mana base as a toolbox. The interaction this has with bounce lands is especially noteworthy. On a turn where you cannot make a land drop, Crop Rotation can act as a tapped land, because if you have 2 untapped lands, you can sacrifice one of them to play Crop Rotation, put the bounce land into play, float a mana off of your other land, return it to your hand, and play it again, which leaves you right where you started, with access to 2 mana, but one of your lands is now worth 2. The drawback is that one of your mana will go away when the phase ends, and if you do it at instant speed, you can't immediately replay the land, but you will have that land in your hand when the turn comes around instead of Crop Rotation. Some other considerations are the lands with Enters the Battlefield abilities that you can now use at instant speed. Reap and Sow is the only other common land tutor I know of, but it's expensive. But Elvish Rejuvenator lets you put a land into play, so that could push it over the edge into being an include. But similarly, any deck that's playing a lot of cantrips, scry, or other filters is going to have an easier time finding Basilisk Gate, which is another factor to consider. Overall, I'd have to say that I'm low on Gates in 2-color decks, and prefer it as a package that I don't have to devote a lot of slots to in a 3 and 5-color deck. Meaning that sometimes I only run Basilisk Gate, ones that let you name a color when they enter, and no tutors. I even don't play Heap Gate because I try very hard to limit my colorless lands, especially in my decks with 3 or more colors. We can now finally move past Gates, so I now want to touch on some cards that help limit the number of tap lands you need and influences other deck building decisions down the line. They're the spells with land type cycling from the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set. These are being considered an auto-include because they do a pretty good impression of Ash Barrens in most situations, which makes them very powerful. You can't just play them like Ash Barrens, but I cycle Ash Barrens most of the time anyway. The trade-off is that if you need them to grab a different color, like you have Troll of Khazad-dûm and need blue, you need to include a land with both basic land types to go find, which Pauper has 2 cycles of, one with the snow type and one without. I found that playing one of the duels is sufficient for this if you're trying to reduce the tap land count because the duel will be in your deck 90% of the time, and I usually just tutor for a basic to play untapped anyway, but that's less true for decks with more than 2 colors. But even in some of those, the utility of dumping a creature into your graveyard has advantages like with Delve and reanimate spells like Late to Dinner and Red Return, which can make it worth it to play anyway, but I think that it's important to note if you're cycling it for a tapped land, that's a net loss of 2 mana. I also want to point out the nuance that you get a lot of control of when that mana is spent. that you're only getting a dual land a small amount of the time, which can really save you, but I think this card intuitively pushes you into a better play pattern of giving you incentive to leave up mana on other players' turns and lets you choose your moment, rather than making you choose before the game even starts, like other tapped lands do. The players actually end up putting less tapped lands into play, which to me means that we could all afford to put less tapped lands in our decks. It seems to me that this is something that the best top tier decks are doing. They just play less tapped lands. If you limit yourself to something like 3 or 4 tap lanes, you're giving yourself a resource advantage before the game even starts. Another part of successful decks playing less tap lanes is that their pilots are selecting commanders that are less color intensive, like monocolor decks or 2-color decks that are primarily 1 color. Some even synergize with artifacts, which are easy to play and further help fix your mana. Others use enchantments. Anyway, to circle back, these cheap land cyclers are one way that we can keep our tapped land count ultra low. Another way I've seen gaining popularity is Shire Terrace. In a 2-color deck, it's functionally identical to a panorama, which is nothing new. These have been considered bad in the past because, like cyclers, these are a net loss of 2 mana when compared to a basic land if you need to crack them, since they cost 1 to crack, and the land comes into play tapped. I think Shire Terrace is only gaining popularity now because competition has pushed innovation to squeeze every last mana out of decks, and it's easier to own a stack of Shire Terraces than the right panorama. Promising Vein is also a functional reprint, meaning that you could run 4 of these in ally colors and 3 in enemy colors. Most of the time right now, only 1 of these shows up in deck lists though, because I think the more colorless sources you play like this, the more likely it is that you're going to have to crack them. And I'm sorry, I keep having to circle back because there's a lot going on with these first few cards because they're all interconnected. I mentioned that I found you can get away with only 1 dual land for the purposes of cycling into it, but there are also reasons that you'd want to have a second one. There's lots of cards like Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Wood Elves, and Skyshroud Claim that are good because they put forests into play untapped, but if you don't need the mana and have these duels, you can put them into play instead, although they will be tapped. The duels also give you access to a few other cards that are better than Rampant Growth, namely Into the North and Farseek. There's also a suite of cards that I've thought about how they fit into this puzzle for a long time. They're the cards that care about having a type of land in play, like Utopia Sprawl, Arbor Elf, and Snuff Out. If this is the reason that you're choosing a tap land, you could just play a New Capenna fetch land, and still be able to play your spell, but also get 1 life to boot. So I don't think that's a solid argument to play one of these over the other, so usually I want my mana to be more flexible, so a duel wins out most of the time. There are still a couple of other cards that I'd put in over a redundant duel though. The first is the Bounce Lands. The benefits other lanes give are usually negligible, but getting an entire extra land in your hand is a substantial benefit. One drawback to these is that the mana from the land that you bounce needs to be used at sorcery speed or you lose it, so that can shut off some of your instant speed spells early, and it is a consideration when you're looking to build your deck. That just leaves us 1 more tapped land slot if we're shooting for 3, so I would then add Path of Ancestry. This is usually going to give us a couple of scries over the course of the game, which I find is enough to edge out the competition for the slot. Most decks play more than 3 tap lands though. In fact, our curve really spikes at 4. One important point that we missed with the cyclers is that they can also go for the conditionally tapped lands from Eldraine, like Mystic Sanctuary, which you only go and find when they're going to enter untapped. I don't play these most of the time, but I'm definitely in the minority. If I am going to increase my tap land count, I usually reach for the cycling lands. I like these better in slow decks with a strong card advantage engine, which end up with a lot of lands in their hand. Those decks tend to need a higher land count at the start of the game and prefer less lands as they go on, so this gives your mana some flexibility. These are also a way to help your decks be more casual. They offer a more consistent, but slower play experience, so I've added them to some mid-range and control decks, especially the ones that generate a lot of mana and can justify paying the 2-cost one. I usually stick to the 1-mana cyclers for competitive. The same logic of giving you a better casual experience applies to the other lands with an ability. The Spheres and Caves are both more casual cards. In competitive, I don't like that they take up a land drop, but if you're not trying to compete with someone winning as soon as possible, they can give you additional options in long games, especially in decks prone to running out of gas. Some lands that I've seen in competitive play are the Depletion lands, and in the rare 3-color competitive deck, the cycle of lands from Invasion that sacrifice themselves for 2 mana. I've said in other videos that I don't like losing mana sources, but there is a place that these belong. It's where your commander is so aggressively trying to win, or generates so much advantage by being in play a turn early, that it makes up for it. But I've seen this backfire more than once, especially in decks that weren't as good at generating value, where the player gets their commander out early, it eats a removal spell, and they do nothing for 4 turns because playing their commander a second time is more difficult. Next I consider the tapped dual lands with abilities like the Campus Cycle. These don't require you to sacrifice them, and they don't have any deck building restraints, so I put these in all of my decks when they came out, but they've slowly come out of pretty much all of my decks, as I've been reducing the tapped land count. They are primarily used after turn 10. which has been too slow in my experience. I also like to compare them to Takasia's Dig Site, which is cheaper to activate, enters untapped, and can put cards into your graveyard. The new Capenna lands that sacrifice to draw a card bear mentioning at this point, but follow the same logic as the spheres. I want my lands in play a lot of the time, and paying twice as much as a sphere is pretty damning. That leaves us with the Zendikar lands that enter tapped, make a color, and do something minor. I don't really play these in any of my decks, and I'll explain why. The Jukabog is the best of these, and I can't fault anyone for running them, but I don't run it because Graveyard Hate usually needs to be instant speed to make a big difference. It also only affects a small portion of decks, so it suffers from the same issue that narrow hate pieces like Sultari Visionary do. You don't get to pick where it goes. You put it on the player that it hates out the best, which seldomly lines up with who the threat at the table is. That just puts you and the other player behind, while the other two quote-unquote uninvolved players get ahead for free. Fertile Thicket being tapped slows you down too much for the consistency to matter. Elamar Death sees a lot of play, especially in combo where finding your pieces is everything. My combo decks also tend to be value piles that aren't quite as desperate for specific cards, so I'd rather have more mana and an untapped land. Lonely Garden does see play in Aristocrats decks. Kabira Crossroads sees play in life gain decks, but isn't generically good enough outside of that. Mortuary Mire is one of the more complicated ones. The way I see it, there's 3 things that can happen when you play this. The first is that you don't need a creature as your next draw, so you play the tap land for no benefit. The second is that you get a creature that provides a resource like drawing you a card. The majority of these cost 3, but even if you have a 2 cost like Dust Legion Zealot, you've improved your draw by getting an extra 1/1 in play before you get to the same state you would have been at if you had just drawn your card, but the cost is 3 or 4 extra mana, which is a pretty bad rate. The last scenario is where you have a card so good that it will carry you to victory, and you get to do it a couple of times. There aren't that many bombs in our format, but there are some, like Grey Merchant of Asphodel and debatably Crypt Rats. I think the first 2 scenarios happen far too often to justify the third scenario. The second scenario where you use Mortuary Mire to gain some advantage stands in the way of you finding your strong piece, and I don't think that those cards need a lot of help being good. Just play your normal efficient recursion. This logic doesn't hold as true if you have something that strong in your command zone though. For example, I've seen Mortuary Mire in decks with Grey Merchant and Crypt Rats in the command zone, and it performed well there. I still wondered as I watched them though, if they wouldn't have been better off drawing a random card, and paying the command tax with an untapped land though. I guess that's why I don't play Reanimator decks. Ranamarsh is just as generically bad as Sunscorched Desert, and I'd rather have an untapped land. Skyland Cascade taps a creature when it enters, and keeps it tapped for a turn. I've been really surprised by how strong tapping creatures can be in this format, but not by this. Smoldering Spires plays really similar to Skyland Cascade, but it doesn't let your other opponents attack in like tapping the creature does, which makes it worse. Soaring Seacliff has tempted me many times. When my deck needs evasion, I don't like to dedicate a lot of deck slots to it. I prefer cards like Slip Through Space, Cartouche of Knowledge, and Aven Windcaller that replace themselves. Soaring Seacliff is easy to explain away as not actually taking up a deck slot, but I said tempted earlier because I've been able to add a sufficient amount of evasion in the main deck that I can have an untapped land to get set up faster. Teetering Peaks and Turntimber Grove are the last 2. They both give a creature a temporary buff. Sorcery Speed pump spells need to give a permanent buff to matter in my opinion. I wouldn't play a Sorcery Speed Giant Growth, so I don't think that 1 or 2 power is worth even half a card to justify these. The rest of my mana base I fill with basic lands. I've been accused of not being greedy enough for a mana base because I load up with so many basics, but to me, this is me being greedy. But how many total lands should you play? I wish I had a clean answer to this question, but I think the most effective way of determining this is by goldfishing your deck many times. To give you a starting point, when I collected the data on the number of tap lands players have, I also noted the total land count. Monocolor decks average 34.27, and 2-color decks average 34.28. So I'm going to take that to mean that the number of colors you play doesn't have a large bearing on the total number of lands you should play. My own decks with more colors do tend to have more lands though. The biggest things that I've noticed affect the total number of lands in a deck are 1. How much ramp you play. If a deck plays no ramp spells, I've been more comfortable at 36 or 37 lands, while decks with lots of ramp are closer to 33. How much draw power your deck has. If your deck just draws cards into more cards that draw cards, you churn through your deck until you hit cards that don't redraw, so you want to play fewer lands in those decks. And 3. How many cards with land cycling you have. There are more than just the Lord of the Rings cyclers. There are many that cost 2 to cycle for a land, that aren't as ubiquitous as the 1-mana cyclers that end up finding their way into many decks. I think White has the best ones with Alabaster Host Intercessor, which removes commanders from play pretty well, and Sunblade Samurai that won't show up on most of your Scryfall searches, which gains you 2 life when it cycles. 5 mana to play a cycler as a creature seems to be a pretty good rate. For 6 mana, you can find some with basic land cycling instead of cycling for a specific type, and you can get some decent abilities. For 7 mana, you get some decently strong abilities, but 7 is too much to play in most decks. I've experimented with combining these to reduce the number of lands in my deck as much as possible while trying not to go too far. And I have to say that I've been pretty successful, but I've run into an issue where you have to have at least 2 lands in your opening hand to get the ramping, cantripping, and cycling started consistently, so once you hit about 30 lands, you can't cut it anymore without reducing your consistency. You can solve the problem in other ways, like adding looting effects to turn those extra lands into relevant resources. I've heard people describing building a mana base like eating your vegetables. It's not fun cutting lands with abilities, making more room for lands, and allocating spell slots to mana fixing, but this is a game of resources, and a mana base is your foundation. Last, I do want to talk about monocolor mana bases. Just because you don't have to worry about having a second color, doesn't mean that when a land enters tapped, it doesn't hurt you just as bad. I see a monocolor deck, and I'm excited that I don't have to add a lot of tap lands. Some players still put tons of tap lands in their deck, which is giving up one of the major advantages that you have. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like, and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Patreon shoutout to Dax, Achu, and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you. When I need players for my Monday Pauper Commander streams, I use the Looking for Group channel in the Common Connoisseurs Discord to find additional players. It's free to join, so even if you don't plan to find games there, I'd still recommend joining. It's just a great place to talk about competitive Pauper Commander.